The bright lights of the laboratory hummed like a low, constant buzz, a sound that would have been soothing to anyone else. But to Chao Tianyu, the young photographer standing before the massive optical equipment, it was just a reminder of how much he hated having to work at all hours of the night. His eyes were bleary from the endless hours of tweaking lenses and adjusting light sources. His assistant, a nervous techie named Li, stood in the corner, pressing a tablet against his chest, already sweating from the impending experiment. The room was too sterile, too quiet. Everywhere he looked, cold, metallic surfaces and gleaming glass stared back at him, mocking the creativity he felt was slowly draining out of his soul. "I'm telling you, the angle's off," Tianyu muttered, fiddling with the controls. "This experiment's supposed to change everything about optical physics, and I can't even get the damn thing to point in the right direction." "You said that last time," Li replied, the uncertainty in his voice punctuated by an involuntary glance at the heavy-duty light system at the center of the lab. He wasn't exactly thrilled about being so close to something that had the potential to blind a man or, worse, burn him alive. "Are you sure this is safe?" "Safe?" Tianyu snorted, looking up from his work. "Safety is for amateurs. You know the deal, Li. We're pushing boundaries here. Don't you want to be part of something revolutionary?" Li swallowed but didn't respond. The truth was, he didn't, but he wasn't about to argue. He had seen the way Tianyu worked, driven, single-minded, obsessed with capturing perfection in a world that had no place for it. Tianyu adjusted his camera again. It was an absurdly complex setup, a network of lasers, lenses, and mirrors arranged in a carefully orchestrated configuration that was supposed to push the boundaries of light, bending it in ways no one had ever imagined. The goal was simple: control light itself. To be able to bend and shape it at will, to manipulate shadows and photons to create any image, any perception, at any moment. Tianyu had the perfect instincts for photography, but the tech behind this experiment was a whole other beast. That's why he was here tonight, trying to harness the future that he flicked a switch on the control panel, and the machine whined to life. At first, it was a small flicker, like the hum of a fluorescent bulb. But then it began to grow. Tianyu's heart skipped a beat as the intense light grew brighter, whiter, until it flooded the lab. It was a perfect, pure beam, the kind of light he had spent years chasing in his photography. But this wasn't light from a bulb or the sun, it was different. This was engineered light, light that could be molded, shaped, used as a tool of creation. "I'm going to take a shot," Tianyu said, pulling his camera into position. Li's voice trembled, growing more urgent. "Tianyu, don't," but it was too late. Tianyu pressed the shutter, and the entire room erupted in a blinding, searing flash. The last thing he remembered before his vision went white was the sound of glass shattering. When Tianyu came to, he was sprawled across the cold, tiled floor of the lab, his head aching and his ears ringing. The light had vanished, leaving an eerie darkness in its wake. His heart raced. He could still feel the residual energy of the burst of light in his body, as if it had seeped into his very bones. He blinked, trying to focus on the scene around him. The lab was in disarray. Equipment lay scattered across the floor, a few chairs overturned, but the worst of it was the hole in the ceiling. The light had torn through it like a laser cutting through butter. His camera was still in his hand, untouched by the chaos, but something was wrong. Something didn't feel right. Tianyu pushed himself to his feet, his head swimming. He glanced around the room again, but this time he felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, darker. They were no longer static, they moved, almost like living things, stretching and folding in response to his every movement. He turned his hand in front of him. The shadow of his fingers seemed to linger a little too long on the wall, almost as if the light was reluctant to leave him. He pulled back, startled. He should have been disoriented, maybe even in pain. But there was no dizziness, no blurriness to his vision. Instead, there was clarity. A sharpness that felt new, like he could see the world in a way that wasn't just physical. "Li?" Tianyu called out, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. Tianyu began to move toward the door, but as he stepped across the threshold, something caught his eye. On the wall just ahead, a reflection of himself appeared, his own image, standing motionless in the hallway. But Tianyu hadn't moved yet. His reflection, however, was already walking ahead, a perfect duplicate of him. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was then that he understood. He wasn't just seeing light differently. He had become it. He had become shadow and light itself, able to manipulate the very forces that had once been beyond his reach. For the next few days, Tianyu tested his newfound abilities. It wasn't a simple skill. This wasn't some magic trick he could use at will. No, this was something far more complex. With focus, he could bend light around him, cloak himself in shadows, distort the environment with illusions so powerful that even his mind had trouble distinguishing what was real. He could become invisible, fade in and out of his surroundings, or manipulate the appearance of objects with a flick of his wrist. It was exhilarating. The first time he used his power for something practical was when he slipped into a bank vault one evening. He'd received an anonymous tip about a corrupt corporate executive using the system to hide funds. Tianyu didn't need to break into the vault. He didn't even need to touch the door. Instead, he projected an illusion of the keycard being swiped, the code being entered, an image so vivid that even the security cameras didn't register anything unusual. The next thing he knew, he was inside the vault, with stacks of illegal money spread out before him. He laughed to himself, shaking his head. He hadn't even needed to do anything except think it into existence. The thrill of it was intoxicating, but the more he used his abilities, the more he felt himself changing. He started noticing things he hadn't before. People's expressions seemed to flicker in his peripheral vision, like they were illusions themselves. Sometimes, when he caught someone looking at him, he felt as though they weren't truly seeing him at all, but something that had been projected into their minds. Something that wasn't real. And there was something else, too, a feeling that he wasn't alone in this world of shadows. That there were others out there, people who knew how to use light in ways far darker than he could ever imagine. He could feel their presence, just beyond his reach. That night, as Tianyu sat in his apartment, reviewing the photographs he'd taken, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. You are not the only one with the power to control the light. Tianyu stared at the message for a long time. The feeling of unease began to settle in, like a shadow creeping over the edges of his mind. He had known something like this was inevitable. If his experiment had created these abilities, surely it had done the same for others, but who? And for what purpose? Under the dim light of his apartment, Tianyu's eyes never left the cryptic text message. The words seemed to pulse on the screen, as if they were waiting for his next move, daring him to respond. His thumb hovered over the reply button, but something held him back. There was a sense of foreboding in those words, a recognition that whatever was happening to him wasn't just a gift or an accident, it was part of something larger, something he didn't fully understand. He tossed the phone on the couch and stood up, pacing the room, his thoughts racing. The world outside his apartment felt far away, but also unnervingly close. He could feel the shadows in the corners of the room pulling at him, as if they were alive, eager to merge with his own shadow, to pull him deeper into a world he wasn't sure he wanted to be part of. He flexed his fingers, testing his power again. With a thought, his hand disappeared into the shadow cast by the low-hanging lamp. His entire arm seemed to dissolve into nothingness before snapping back, the light catching the edges of his skin once more. Tianyu had grown accustomed to the oddity of his abilities. He could hide in plain sight, slip into a darkened corner of a room and become invisible, or conjure entire illusions that were so real he almost forgot they were just images. It was thrilling, but also isolating. The more he used his power, the more disconnected he felt from the world he had once known. His photographs had once been his way to capture life, to frame it in a way that felt meaningful. But now, even photography felt hollow. What was the point of capturing something when you could make it appear and disappear at will? Was there anything real anymore? His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. The same number. A new message. You think you control it, but you are merely a conduit. You are being watched. You are being shaped. A chill ran through him. Whoever this was knew more about him than he was comfortable with. He'd always prided himself on being in control, on knowing what he was doing, on capturing the perfect shot, on knowing when to take the picture and when to let it slip away. But now it seemed that control had slipped from his hands like sand. The feeling gnawed at him. His power had come too quickly, and its cost was starting to reveal itself. Tianyu grabbed his phone and typed out a response, his fingers shaking slightly. "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "We are everywhere. Watching. Waiting. You cannot escape what you have become." He stared at the words, his heart thumping in his chest. He stood frozen in place for a long moment, uncertainty creeping in. This was no coincidence. Whoever had sent this message knew about the experiment, knew about his abilities, and knew exactly what he was capable of. It was almost as if they were anticipating his every move. There was a knock at the door. Tianyu's heart skipped a beat. It was late, far too late for anyone to be visiting. He approached the door cautiously, stepping lightly on the wooden floor, trying not to make a sound. He hadn't heard anyone come up the stairs, no footsteps outside the apartment. Just silence. He pressed his ear to the door, but there was no sound from the other side, just the faint hum of the city far below. He debated whether to open it or not. Every instinct told him to run, to hide, but something compelled him to unlock the door. Slowly, he turned the handle and cracked it open, his heart racing. Nothing, there was no one standing in the hallway, no figure lurking in the shadows. Just a single sheet of paper, lying on the floor. Tianyu knelt down and picked it up. It was a photograph, a high-resolution shot of him, standing at the control panel in the lab, the very moment the explosion of light had happened. The clarity was startling. He'd never seen the image before, and yet, there he was, captured in the midst of the disaster, his body surrounded by a blur of light, the camera's lens reflecting the intensity of the flash. But it wasn't just a photo. It was a warning, written in the corner, in bold black ink, were 3 simple words: "You are marked." He stared at the photograph, his hands trembling. Who could have taken this? Who could have known exactly where he had been? It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message, and it was meant for him. Tianyu slammed the door shut, locking it this time, and backed away. His mind was racing, but his body felt paralyzed. He had no idea who was behind this, who these people were, or what they wanted. But the message was clear. He wasn't in control anymore. He wasn't the one pulling the strings. The room felt smaller, the shadows growing longer. He could hear them now, the whispers. They were in the corners of the room, in the dark spaces, where the light couldn't reach. His breath quickened. His powers were still there, still waiting for him to command them, but for the first time, Tianyu wasn't sure he wanted to. What had started as an incredible gift, something he could wield and shape, had now become something far darker, something beyond his understanding. He sank into a chair, his head spinning. The weight of everything was crushing him. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to take control again. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little control he actually had. He wasn't just facing some criminal syndicate or a group of rogue criminals. He was dealing with something far more dangerous, something that had been watching him from the shadows long before he had even realized what was happening. The phone buzzed again, and Tianyu's heart sank. The message wasn't a surprise, but it still hit him like a blow. "We are the eclipse. You will join us. Or you will burn." Tianyu's blood ran cold. The eclipse. The name struck a chord in his mind, and suddenly, everything clicked. The whispers, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something far darker was lurking in the background, it all made sense now. The eclipse wasn't just a group of rogue operatives or criminals using the power of light. They were something more, something far older, and they were planning something big, something that could reshape the world. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't pretend this wasn't happening. His abilities, his powers, they weren't his to control anymore. They belonged to something larger, something that had its sights set on him. Tianyu had no choice now. The stakes were too high. He could try to fight back, to expose the truth and take down the eclipse, but he knew that would come at a price. Or he could join them, align himself with the very forces that had pushed him into this world of shadows and light. Either way, there was no going back. The decision gnawed at him. He stood up, pacing again, his mind torn between the two paths that seemed to be pulling him in opposite directions. He could feel the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders. Every moment of indecision made the shadows grow longer. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with their pressure, but one thing was clear: Tianyu couldn't keep hiding forever. The phone buzzed again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He picked it up, his fingers numb, and typed a response. "What do you want from me?" The answer came swiftly. "Come to us. Only then will you understand." Tianyu dropped the phone on the table. His thoughts were no longer his own. The choice had been made for him. The door opened. Tianyu's heart thudded in his chest as the door to his apartment swung open, but the hallway outside was empty. His pulse hammered in his ears, but the weight of the situation settled on him. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or disappointed. The invitation was clear: come to us. Only then will you understand. Whoever they were, they had been watching him long before he even realized the depth of his powers. And now, it seemed, there was no escaping them. He stepped back from the door, his gaze darting across the apartment. The shadows, once just quiet corners of his space, now felt alive, stretching toward him like tendrils, hungry for something he couldn't name. Tianyu knew it was pointless to try and outrun them. He couldn't run from the eclipse, not from what they represented, not from the pull of his own abilities. They had always been lurking in the background of his life, and now they were here, at the center of everything. His mind raced, bouncing between defiance and fear. In the end, he knew one thing for sure: he had no choice but to go to them. It was nearly midnight by the time Tianyu stepped outside. The city streets were quiet, bathed in an eerie, ghostly glow from the flickering streetlights. His steps echoed off the pavement, the sound sharp in the stillness. The shadows stretched unnaturally, their dark forms bending in ways that felt almost like they were beckoning him. Every corner he turned, every step he took, felt like a part of him was slowly being drawn deeper into their web. He had no clear destination, just the direction he had felt pulled toward since that message had appeared on his phone. The city was vast, full of its secrets and whispers, but for the first time, it felt as if it was watching him, as if it had always known this moment would come. As he walked, his mind churned. He had never imagined that his photography, his art, would lead him to this. What had once been a way to capture fleeting moments of beauty had now become something far more dangerous. The manipulation of light and shadow was no longer about creating pictures, it was about controlling perceptions, bending reality to his will. And yet, that control felt precarious. At any moment, he might lose himself to it. The more he thought about the eclipse, the more he realized how little he understood them. He knew only one thing for certain: they were a force, an entity that thrived in the shadows, and they were not playing by the same rules as everyone else. His mind kept returning to their words: "You are being shaped." What did that mean? What were they turning him into? He stopped in front of a small alley, the shadows there feeling particularly thick, as though they were waiting for him to pass through. There was a sense of finality in the moment, a momentary hesitation that made the air feel charged. This wasn't just about powers anymore. This was about control. The eclipse had their eyes on him, and whether he liked it or not, he was part of their plan. Tianyu didn't know if he would be able to survive what was coming next, but he knew he couldn't escape it. Turning down the alley, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. There, at the end of the passageway, a figure stood in the shadows. Tall, imposing, almost featureless except for the faint glint of light off a pair of glasses. The figure didn't move, but Tianyu could feel their eyes on him, watching him. A chill ran down his spine, looking for something. The voice was deep, smooth, almost casual, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Tianyu didn't reply immediately, trying to assess the figure in front of him. His instincts told him to be cautious, but the strange pull in his gut told him that he needed to keep moving forward. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady, though his pulse was beginning to quicken. The figure stepped forward, moving as if the darkness itself was an extension of them. Their face remained obscured in shadow, but their presence was undeniable. "You're Chao Tianyu, the one with the light," the figure said. Their tone wasn't accusatory, just matter-of-fact. "We've been waiting for you." Tianyu's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Waiting for me? Why?" The figure smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "You've always been part of this. You just didn't know it yet. The eclipse has been watching you for some time, Tianyu. Watching your experiments, watching your photography. You've had the power to change reality since the moment you stepped into that lab." Tianyu didn't know what to say. He had always thought his ability was an accident, something he stumbled into. But hearing this, feeling the weight of the words, made him realize just how wrong he had been. His accident had never been random. It had been a signal, a beacon that had drawn the eclipse to him. "You can stop pretending you're in control now," the figure said, almost like they were reading his thoughts. "The power you've unlocked? It's not yours to keep. It never was." Before Tianyu could react, the figure moved, faster than he could track. One moment, they were a shadow at the end of the alley, and the next, they were standing right in front of him, their face still hidden. "Who are you?" Tianyu demanded, his heart racing. He was beginning to feel cornered, the same way he had felt back in his apartment when he had read the message. The figure finally spoke again, their voice almost a whisper. "I am Obsidian." Tianyu's breath caught in his chest. He had heard the name before. It had been mentioned in passing, in rumors, whispers of someone who had once been part of the same lab where Tianyu had experimented with the light, someone who had fallen into darkness. "The eclipse is not just a group," Obsidian continued. "It's a revolution. A way of seeing the world. A way of reshaping the world through perception itself. And you, Tianyu, are the key to all of it. You can control light and shadow, bend it to your will. You can make the world believe whatever you want it to believe. The world is built on illusions, and now, you can shape them. You can bring about the change we've been waiting for." Tianyu's mind reeled. He wanted to fight. He wanted to reject everything Obsidian was saying. But deep down, there was something that pulled at him. The power. The freedom. He could see it now, the potential to remake the world, to control reality itself. I don't want to control the world," Tianyu said, his voice barely above a whisper. Obsidian tilted his head. "You don't have a choice, Tianyu. The world has always been controlled. You were just too blind to see it. We've given you the power to see the truth. Now you will help us reshape it." Tianyu shook his head, his thoughts racing. He wasn't ready to surrender. He didn't want this. But even as he thought it, he felt the pull of the shadows, the growing temptation of all that he could do with the abilities he now possessed. Obsidian's hand reached out, and Tianyu felt a surge of power, something sharp and cold, as though the shadows themselves were gathering around him. "You don't have to decide now," Obsidian said. "But we'll be waiting. Come to us when you're ready. We'll show you how far this power can take you." With that, Obsidian stepped back, vanishing into the darkness as though he had never been there. Tianyu stood in the alley, breathing heavily, his mind in turmoil. The shadows seemed to press in on him, growing thicker, more oppressive. The choice was now his. But could he make the right one?